Hello, welcome. Week 1, Philosophy, Gender Studies 390, Feminist Philosophy. So this is just going to be a short video, and I'll probably do this every week, maybe more than once per week, just to say a few words about the readings themselves. So this week you'll notice there are 5 readings listed there. Normally there's not that many. Now in this case it's not so bad. The last 3, those 3 dealing with the theme of silencing, none of those are terribly long. They're relatively kind of easy to read. They're thought-provoking, and I think you'll enjoy them. Try to read at least a couple of them. I bet you'll read them all. The other 2, there's a piece from Bell Hooks, which is not terribly long. It's only about 6 or 7 pages, I think. And even shorter is that little excerpt from a report from the World Economic Forum. So it's actually not that much to read. So here, I'm mainly just going to say a few words about the Bell Hooks piece and maybe just touch on the World Economic Forum. And the others you can read, and maybe it will come up in our class discussions this week or perhaps in later weeks as well. So, the Bell Hooks piece. Bell Hooks is a pen name. You may know that. The author's name is Gloria Watkins. She's been a very important figure in feminist theory for many decades. The piece itself that we have here dates from 1984. There's a few references in it that are a little dated, but otherwise it's really quite timely, and frankly, in some ways, maybe even more appropriate for 2019 than it was in 1984. So it relates the main idea there, and why we're putting it at the beginning. It has to do with the question of what is feminism. She's dealing with that question, recognizing that there's no easy answers. Recognizing, too, that people typically might think, well, it has to do with trying to achieve equality between men and women. That's certainly true. That has to be true. But Bell Hooks is just concerned that when we think about it in those terms or try to define it that way, it's not very helpful, and possibly even unhelpful, for a couple of reasons. First, equality can mean, and does mean, very different things for different people. So sometimes, even if people say they're in favor of this or that kind of equality, they may actually have very different things in mind. And secondly, and more importantly perhaps, she just recognizes that there's widespread inequality in society, and among men as well. So to speak of achieving equality with men really does not say very much. And in that way, that's one of the ways at least, that this piece may be at least as relevant, if not more, to our society today in 2019. The question of pervasive forms of inequality throughout society. So what she proposes then, how we ought to think about feminism, is in terms of an opposition to just what she calls sexist oppression. So it's more a question of what we're against. She doesn't want to be negative. She just thinks that this puts a sharper focus, a more concrete focus on what we mean by feminism. She thinks that this can allow us then to be clearer about what we're trying to achieve, who's for it and who's against it, and so on. And that when we do start thinking about sexist oppression in those concrete terms, it will, she does think, lead us to kind of a broader, more general analysis of society where we recognize, and this is a theme that we will come back to in a few weeks, that the issues of central concern to feminism are kind of inextricably bound up with other kinds of questions too, that it's not simply a kind of a one-dimensional issue at all, but it's kind of entangled with other questions that run across society, other forms of inequality that would have to be addressed as well if the goals of feminism are to be achieved. So that's kind of her main point there. Something I asked you to think about is just why she then says it may be more helpful to say something like, this is how she puts it, I advocate feminism, right? As opposed to saying something like, I am a feminist. Just try to think about the reasons she gives for saying that and so on. I mean, the basic idea seems to be that she's worried that when we think in terms of, say, being a feminist, when you say, I am a feminist, say, that it's possible and sometimes maybe even likely, the various forms of what nowadays we might call implicit bias can still be in effect. And we may be thinking too much in terms of one's own identity, and possibly actually then proposing a view of feminism which is actually somewhat exclusive or serves to exclude certain groups that perhaps should, by all rights, be included in our concern for equality. She puts it in a way something like this sometimes, if I recall, right? In terms of like a lifestyle thing, as opposed to what she thinks is a better way to think about better way to think about it in terms of a more sort of deliberate, self-conscious political commitment to bring about certain kinds of social change. That's what she thinks is better when we put it the way she was advising. I advocate or I stand for feminism, rather than making this kind of claim about identifying with it. In any case, it's something to think about, and it will come up in our class discussion. Just briefly, the other piece you'll have a look at from the World Economic Forum, it's partly meant as a contrast. Bell Hooks is a fairly radical thinker. That's what's wonderful about her. The World Economic Forum, not exactly. Much more kind of straight-laced, much more just moderate. And so it gives this analysis. They do this kind of research into inequalities across the world in terms of gender, and then they put together a report. And just what's striking, as I noted on Blackboard and in other places, is just the way they present some of their conclusions in terms of the time it will take, right? Given the pace of progress that has been made, how long we might expect before there is more complete gender equality. And sometimes the numbers are really quite striking. They kind of blow me away when it tells me that even in relatively or more advanced countries, the gender gap is going to remain for over a century longer, that we may not even live to see that day. It's kind of surprising. At any rate, let me know your own responses to that. Maybe it's not surprising at all. But that's basically all what we're looking at there. It's very short, just 2 pages or not even. Just have a look at that and think about that. If you care, you can certainly look up the entire report. By all means, feel free to do so. But it's basically just to remind us, contrary to what sometimes some people will say today, that it's all over, that equality has in effect been achieved. It's actually, at least especially on a global scale, really quite far from that, and that can just help perhaps motivate us to take more seriously a lot of these concerns. But anyway, that's for now just a few ideas about that. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. We're going to get going hopefully this week, probably a little bit later this week. Once you get through some of these readings, get onto Flipgrid, and we'll get class discussion going, and I hope it'll be a very lively and dynamic forum. Well, that's all for now.